So then perhaps it's a combination, right? So maybe you've got these visionary leaders, but then you've got the mass movements, whether it's abolitionists or other.
Well, how would you describe Lincoln?
Was
he a visionary or pragmatist, or maybe both?
Well, so what I'm saying is I think the mass movements create space for...
What mass movements are you talking about?
Well, so I would ask you as the historian, but there was the
You mean
growing
the
abolitionist
secessionist movement? It was a mass movement.
Sure. Yeah.
Okay. The anti-abolitionists were the what about those in the North who were dead set against emancipation? Are they a mass movement?
Popular movements, okay. Right? But at some point, you have to say that the abolitionists and people opposed to slavery were creating enough space for
sure.
Lincoln to come in and say, "Okay, by the way, I'm opposed to."
Well, you've got to look at, in a sense, I think you have to look at what was going on almost day by day, as first the secession crisis and then the war unfolds. Okay, Lincoln was trying to get a handle on what was going on. I mean, he's got 7 states that have declared that they're leaving the Union. How is he going to deal with it?
Mm-hmm.
How is he going to get them back in? How is he going to save the country? Because after all, if the Union weren't saved, slavery would continue to exist. Okay, maybe the North could say, well, our hands are clean now. But disunion was something I think he legitimately thought was a horrifying spectacle. It would have led to terrible consequences.
And so what was it that ultimately turned the opinion firmly in the North? Was it the radicalization of the South and their secessionist movement, or was it something about Lincoln and the arguments he was making to the people?
Well, I think Lincoln is a key figure.
Mm-hmm.
I think although he did not have anywhere near the experience in political life that Jefferson Davis did, I think he turned out to be a much more astute politician. And that's what you need, a good politician. And so...
Explain why you say that. What was it about him?
Well, he needed to have a good handle on, political currents, certainly in the North, but also in the South, too. Mm-hmm. He also had, a good intuitive understanding of the international context in which the Civil War was being fought. Keeping Britain out of the Civil War. That was very important.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
What happens is, well, first of all, if Lincoln said he was against slavery, what could he do about it? I mean, he had no authority to abolish slavery.
As president, you're saying?
Yeah, as
even
president.
After he was elected?
Yeah, he couldn't do anything about it. So why try to exercise power if you have no power? You're just going to look foolish, and it's going to, backfire. And also, he had to get it, after the firing on Fort Sumter in the spring of 1861, Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers, 3 months, to come down and put this rebellion down. What happened? 4 states, more states joined the secession. Virginia, several others. Mm-hmm. Well, what would happen if Maryland and Kentucky and Missouri decided to get out too? That would have been a disaster. These are slave states, and there were powerful forces that wanted to take those states out of the Union. In fact, when Lincoln went to Washington for his inauguration, he had to be snuck through Baltimore because there were pro-secessionist riots there.
So the North was by no means guaranteed victory here.
No,
outside
absolutely
of the Civil
not.
So what was it that turned the tide of opinion and galvanized people? I mean, we often forget just how bloody the Civil War was. I mean, do you have the figures for the deaths? I mean, it's greater than...
Yeah, the figures, well, the up until recently, the figures were about 650,000 dead on total both sides. That figure now is being revised upwards. Scholars are going through, death records and population statistics and so forth. So I think you could use the figure 700,000. Now,
you had in single battles, right?
Yeah.
Tens of thousands of individuals dying. Is that correct?
Yeah.
That's mind-boggling.
Yeah. I mean, if you go by population, proportion of population, the United States now has, 315 million people. That would be comparable to the United States fighting a war and losing probably 8 or 9 million soldiers.
Wow.
Mostly soldiers.
Yeah.
So that's how devastating it was. Yeah.
So, okay, I know we're sort of running out of time. We might have to come back and do another interview about the Civil War. There's so much to talk about. But go back to Fort Sumter.
Mm-hmm.
Who initiated that conflict? Who was it, the North
what
or
had
the
happened?
South?
Well, actually, this shows Lincoln's smarts. Because I wouldn't say maneuvered, but he set up a situation where the South fired first, and that was very, very important.
Mm-hmm.
What happened was that when South Carolina and other states seceded, what they did is they seized federal property, and this would be arsenals, post offices, customs houses, military facilities. Now, bear in mind, the United States does not have a large military. I mean, the Army had maybe 10,000 troops total at the time. So it wasn't the huge establishment we see now. Mm-hmm. So they were seizing them. But in Charleston Harbor, the commander of the fort there, an Army major, said, "I'm not giving in. This is disloyalty. This is treason." And so eventually what he did was he moved his troops over to a newer semi-built Fort Sumter. And there was a kind of standoff between the South Carolina authorities and their armed forces and this Army garrison. And what happened was Lincoln sent a secret message to, I think, to Jefferson Davis. He didn't want to do it in public because that would mean recognition of the Confederacy, mm-hmm. saying, I'm going to try to resupply these people with an unarmed vessel. Well, that was driven back. And then the South Carolina authorities, with the permission of Jefferson Davis, the newly inaugurated Confederate president, decided, we've had enough. This small garrison is a violation of our sovereignty. So they opened fire, and bombarded the place for hours and hours on end. Interestingly enough, nobody got hurt.
Right.
But what it did do, the firing on Fort Sumter galvanized, it created this real strong backlash in the North, demand that, the administration do something to put down this treasonous rebellion.
Well, and if you have time,
Sure.
I want to sort of build on that question of treason and just visit this idea of the Confederate flag mm-hmm. and what that represents. And you made a slightly provocative comment off the air at one point. And I don't know if you are willing to revisit it here, but that there is an element of treason in venerating the Confederate flag.
Well, let's put it this way. If you look at every domestic challenge to the very existence of the United States, okay, what has been the most serious challenge? It has not come from immigrants. It hasn't come from blacks or African Americans. It has not come from Jews or Catholics or anybody, any of these groups. Where does it come from? It's come from, the South or those who supported secession. Mm-hmm. It is the most dangerous challenge to the very existence of the United States. And the Confederate flag represents that effort. Okay? And that's, it's perhaps inflammatory to say that the Confederate flag represents treason. But what else does it represent?
Well, there are people in the South, I think, that would make the case that there was an element of the population that was sort of connected to this idea of their community and the sovereignty of their community, and that the Confederate flag is a complicated symbol. Mm-hmm. It represents a complex set mm-hmm. of values, and not necessarily, say, an endorsement of slavery or even necessarily the desire to secede from the nation. Mm-hmm. Are they fooling themselves, though? I mean, people who would make that argument?
One thing that did happen after the Civil War, especially by the end of the 19th century, is that there was a kind of rewriting of the history of the Civil War, where you had, in fact, it was even mandated in Southern public schools, that the notion that the Civil War was not about slavery. Okay, Civil War is about states' rights and regional integrity and so forth. I think that's a misreading of what actually happened. You know, to be sure, there was a kind of Southern identity that developed, but I mean, why would the South secede? But to preserve, you know, this practice of slavery,
which was central to their way.
Which was central to. I mean, otherwise they'd have no reason to.
Right.
And there is no right of secession. Okay, and when
as far as states' rights go.
Yeah. Well, first of all, what rights of what states were being violated? Well, by the election of Lincoln.
Well, I think, as you were saying, there was more a fear of the potential violation of rights that Lincoln represented.
But what rights, potential rights were being, what rights were in jeopardy? I mean, I'm kind of throwing this out rhetorically.
And I'm going to throw it back to you, and I think that they might say the right to own property, the freedom to own.
Well, that's true, and this is where you have this huge ideological divide, because certainly in the North there was a notion of property rights, but a denial that one could own human beings as property.
Right.
Now, in the South, you know, the slaves were property. Therefore, that property could be used. You know, it's a legitimate practice. So, how do you reconcile those two notions? You know,
well,
I mean, that was the question that came up, and I don't think there was really any answer to that.
Well, and that's where I want to go next. Is, you know, to what extent was that conflict resolved? Did the North win? Did the South lose? You know, is this idea of ultimate equality really something that we abide by in the nation today?
Let's put it this way. Of course, the North won the war. The Union was preserved. And I think that was the consensus in the North, that ultimately is about union. Slavery was abolished with the 13th Amendment. Okay. Now, if you take a look at the fact that slavery was abolished doesn't mean that the conditions in the South approached anywhere near equality.
Right.
That became evident very quickly, and there were attempts during Reconstruction to rebuild Southern society along somewhat egalitarian lines. After all, the 14th Amendment was put into place, and that is to extend rights guaranteed under the U.S. Constitution, to prohibit state and local governments from violating rights that are guaranteed in the Constitution. And then the 15th Amendment, which would prohibit discrimination, discrimination in voting based on race, color, and so forth. So these were put into place. Now, okay, then the question comes up, all right, was full equality achieved? Well, first of all, I don't think the Civil War was, in the minds of people like Thaddeus Stevens, yes, this is a war about equality and as well as liberation, the ending of slavery. But not all Northerners, including not all abolitionists, bought into that. I would say that was still a minority opinion. And
they saw it as what? Union versus disunion?
Union and getting rid of the practice of slavery.
Okay.
But just because you get rid of the practice of slavery doesn't mean that you have anything approaching equality. Okay.
Before we wrap it up for tonight, I did want to go back to this question of why there weren't more uprisings in the South.
Uprisings by
slave uprisings or
well, there was no reason. First of all, before the Emancipation Proclamation, the North was not fighting to liberate slaves. And it actually wasn't. The Emancipation Proclamation was a strange document. It said that basically any state that didn't give up its rebellion by January 1st, 1863, if Union forces get in there, slaves are going to be free. Well, I mean, before the Emancipation Proclamation, there was no reason. Secondly, a slave uprising has probably about 0.001% chance of any success.
Why is that? Wasn't there strength in numbers in a lot of these cases? I mean,
well, you got to have more than numbers.
Yeah.
Well, first of all, slaves only made up a third of the Southern population. Now, granted, they were concentrated in the Deep South, but it takes more than numbers to have an uprising. You've got to have organization, and that means people have got to be organizing it and so forth. And, what would happen? Well, look what happened in the wake of the Nat Turner Rebellion in the early 1830s. Not only were those who rebelled killed, but there was their families, slaves who happened to be in the way, were gunned down or killed. So, yeah, there would have been massive repression, And besides, I mean, why have an uprising? When the Union forces get in here, we're going to be free.
Well, okay, so the Emancipation Proclamation, what was the political calculation of that? Because the way you put it just now, if a Southern seceded state said, forget that whole secession thing, we're still with the Union, they would have been allowed to keep slavery.
No.
Okay.
And that was the tricky part about it. This is why I think Lincoln was kind of a political master. And this is why I think none of the seceding states attempted to rejoin the Union. There was no guarantee that even if they gave up a rebellion, that they could keep slaves. Because one of the things here is that Lincoln's not the only player here. If, say, Virginia, for example, decided, okay, we're going to give up the rebellion, okay, you have under what would be the procedure for getting back into the Union? Well, you had powerful Southern Republicans who were saying, well, by seceding, Virginia has reverted to the status of a territory. And we are committed not to let any territory become a state unless it either prohibited or abolished slavery. So if Virginia wants to get back in the Union, it's going to have to abolish slavery.
That's interesting. So was there a bit of almost doublespeak happening?
Well, I think what Lincoln was doing with the Emancipation Proclamation, I think the nightmare scenario would be for all 11 states to say, okay, we give up. Okay?
Nightmare for who?
Huh?
The nightmare scenario for who?
For abolitionists. But that wasn't going to happen. Okay? First of all, in late 1862, it wasn't inevitable what the outcome of the Civil War would be. I mean, granted, Lee's invasion of Maryland was beaten back at Antietam, but the South was still holding its own, and in a way that worked against slavery. I mean, if it looked like the North was going to be just rolling over the South, then maybe you would have had voices say, well, we ought to get back in the Union. But there was no guarantee that they could keep slavery.
And so the timing, Lincoln, if nothing else, was always had very good timing, right? So
Yeah.
he waited. He knew he was going to do the Emancipation Proclamation, but he waited for a victory from the North.
Yes,
right?
Yes, and Antietam was enough of a victory. I mean, it was pretty touch and go. I mean, it was really basically a stalemate. But Lee had failed to invade Maryland, and he'd failed to take over Maryland and force Maryland out of the Union. So he used that, and I think interestingly enough, as the bodies pile up, I mean, this sounds pretty grisly calculation, but as the bodies pile up, opinion in the North starts to radicalize and saying, okay, we either get out of the war and end this bloodshed, or we're going to have to take more stringent measures. And I think there was a growing feeling that, hey, slavery is at the cause of this bloodshed. And if we're going to have any future peace, and if it's going to be worthwhile, we're going to have to get rid of slavery. I think that body of opinion was growing.
And apparently so did Lincoln. And that was
Yeah.
one of his,
Yeah. Now, he was taking a chance because in November of 1862, there were congressional elections, and the Democrats made gains, but not enough to take over. And, of course, when the Southern states seceded, the Democratic Party in the Congress was decimated because a lot of these, all of these Southern representatives were Democrats.
Mm-hmm. So then back to the Emancipation Proclamation, do you think that this was a known radical swipe by Lincoln? He knew that this was going to be a wedge that he could drive into the heart of slavery.
Let's put it this way. If you look at the terms of the Emancipation Proclamation, it does not apply to Maryland, Kentucky, Missouri, Delaware, or Western Virginia. It did not apply, for example, in New Orleans, where the Union forces had occupied. So areas where the Union controlled, slavery would remain. Okay? It only applied in areas where the Union had no effective authority.
Mm-hmm.
Okay?
But do you think he understood that that was going to start the ball rolling?
Yes, because, once the January 1st, 1863 deadline passed, okay, that was it. If the Union forces get into the other areas of the South, that's it. The Union is committed to getting rid of slavery. And my argument is that if slavery was abolished in Mississippi, it's not going to survive. It would not have survived in Missouri.
All right. Well, I think it's probably about time to...
Well, I enjoyed this.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
do.
Christopher Bean, Professor of History at the University of Southern Maine. Thanks for being on the Soapbox.
Okay. Thank you, Eric.